This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. I'm Damian Collins MP, and today we'll be discussing still unresolved issues from the Cambridge Analytica scandal, whether Facebook's own research has suggested that the platform helps to radicalize its users, and Donald Trump's call for the reform of the safe harbor laws in America that protect social media companies from liability for the content they serve. For all this, I'm joined by David Carroll, Associate Professor for Media Design from the Parsons Faculty at the New School in New York City, and one of the key figures featured in the Netflix documentary, The Great Hack. Alongside John is Gian Volpicelli, Tech and Politics Editor of Wired UK. And as always, we'll be hearing from our resident disinformation analyst, Dr. Charles Creel. David Carroll, it's great to have you on the Infotagion podcast. I remember we first met at the New School in New York in 2018 when we were visiting with the DCMS Select Committee as part of our disinformation inquiry, and you subsequently become familiar to a lot more people, particularly through your fantastic documentary, The Great Hack, that was made for Netflix to such acclaim and tells such an interesting story of the Cambridge Analytica scandal and your quest to get your data. I suppose I must ask where that trail took you in the end.
So thank you, Damian. It's great to speak to you again and to see how your work has continued. It unfortunately still stands that I have not yet received a full subject access request through the Information Commissioner's Office. And we still have not seen a kind of final report of the forensics. So there's still unanswered questions and a kind of unresolved status, even though my legal case is, completely closed and my efforts have concluded. So we did make a lot of progress, and we sort of won battles along the way, but did not achieve the simple goal of getting my complete data set from the company. I only ever received a partial set, and the dispute was over its completeness and over an adequate explanation. So we never got that.
It's extraordinary in a way because you think you're only asking for data that Cambridge Analytica held on you back so you can see what they had. I mean, it's simple. And it just and you've got such extraordinary lengths to try and get that. It just shows the power imbalance here as well, doesn't it? That these companies can acquire data about us, but we've almost got no way of knowing or having any rights to knowing what that data includes.
And indeed, this was because UK law allowed this, and there's no equivalent law in the United States. And so therefore, it was a quirk of sort of history that US data was processed in the UK and therefore was under the jurisdiction of UK law and enforcement. Had our data not been exported abroad, we would have had absolutely no rights to make the request, let alone to have that request enforced. But it is a very visible example of how difficult it is to achieve accountability, especially in the space of explaining how algorithms and data models work. Part of Section 7 of the UK Data Protection Act of 1998 that I filed under provides not only full disclosure, but also adequate explanation. And we didn't achieve that. So it shows how difficult it is to enforce these laws that are even on the books and have been on the books for quite some time.
One of the questions that came out of the Cambridge Analytica scandal, certainly in the UK, I think, as around the time we were producing our committee reports, was, should this sort of data gathering be used in political campaigns? Should you be able to guess what people's deeply held beliefs or fears are and exploit that in an election campaign? And indeed, the Information Commissioner in the UK has suggested that under the European data laws, which are also the UK's data laws, it may not be legal. And I know since that time, there's been a bit of progress. I believe YouTube now don't allow data targeting political ads, but Facebook still do. Now, what's your view on that as America heads into another election cycle?
Yeah, we've made no progress in the United States tackling the issues that became so clear and present in 2016 and beyond. And so it's still a Wild West with regards to the use of voter data and combining it with other data sources and using it in ways that voters are not able to understand. Perhaps the only things that have changed in the US is what platforms have decided to do voluntarily. And these are really whether they are policy things or slight changes to the way that advertising uh, campaigns are built or the settings that users can use to opt out. Um, and there has been some development in state laws trying to advance new privacy regulations and protections. But of course, that's not at the national level. But there has been a lot of discussion in Washington, D.C. about a national privacy act of some sort, and there have been bills that have been floated. So it's been an active debate um, since the issue became sort of a household issue with Cambridge Analytica making this issue understandable for people. I think that's a key role of the scandal, is that it gave people a narrative with a cast of characters and real world consequences to understand a very difficult, abstract, sort of difficult to penetrate topic that is the use of data and targeting. But yeah, so as we move into the election, we can take advantage of basically two things that Facebook has added since the last election: the ads library, which did not exist in the previous election, which allows civil society to see all of the ads a campaign is running and to have some sense of how they're being targeted. It is an incomplete sort of library, and it doesn't give us enough information. So, for example, it does not give adequate targeting information to know, for example, if certain ads have been targeted to specific voters by name. So there's still work to do to create the transparency necessary. And that has helped civil society monitor abuses of the platform and to hold the company account to its own policies. So, the one time, for example, when Facebook acted upon an official Trump campaign advertisement was where it had misleadingly used references to the census. And the census is going on in the US this year. And that is one specific topic that Facebook is willing to enforce. And so it came to the attention of Facebook when reporters found it in the ads library and publicized it, and that pressured the company to enforce its own policies with regards to census misinformation. But of course, most people know that the company has been unwilling to act on any other advertisements by the campaign because they've created these very narrow definitions of issues that they will act upon. So one is census misinformation. The other is voting misinformation that would be specific to spreading false information about voting as a voting suppression tactic. So there's some very specific policies that they're willing to enforce, but as we know, they're not willing to enforce a basic fact checking, nor are they willing to limit the targeting vectors that campaigns can use. So political micro-targeting is alive and well in the United States, just as it was before. Only slight things are different, with sort of a little more transparency and a little more accountability. But it's completely driven by journalism and public relations, not legal issues and legal enforcement.
Sure. we're gripped by a number of crises at the moment around the world. Obviously, coronavirus being a forefront of people's minds. One of the things we've been talking about on the podcast is disinformation campaigns around coronavirus, around fake cures, fake remedies, whether 5G is the source of it. And I think that there's some evidence of coordinated campaigns to boost some of these conspiracy theories to leave people in a state of uncertainty about what to believe. We've also seen, obviously, the extraordinary scenes in America since the death of George Floyd at the hands of the Minneapolis police. And again, there have been reports of social media campaigns inciting hatred and strong feelings around those debates as well. I mean, do you feel that these systems on social media and these targeting mechanisms on social media that you've done so much to explore and highlight are again playing a negative role in the issues we see confronting us today?
Yes, it's hard not to be distressed about the various crises colliding together, and I'm very distressed by the state of the United States at the moment. With each day, it becomes more and more alarming. And we know from reporting recently from the Wall Street Journal that Facebook's own internal studies have known for quite some time that its recommendation algorithms are radicalizing its users. In one case, it found that I think about 60% of users would join a extremist group when they were suggested to it by the group recommendation algorithm and user interface. And of course, the company is aware of how the most sort of emotional and often not based in fact content performs better than truthful content. So that was an alarming report to read, because it shows that the company knows very well how its algorithms amplify false information and radicalize people to more extreme views. And the algorithm is doing that because the algorithm is optimizing for engagement. It's not optimizing for quality, it's optimizing for quantity. And so these are really distressing things to think about in the framework of how the company, is reluctant to take responsibility for its role in fomenting the disunity. And in fact, it's been interesting to hear of Facebook employees within the past day or two have been more actively expressing dissent inside the company over its policies. And so I think we're seeing the company, is struggling to continue to toe this line, that it's going to, continue to be, all about free speech without addressing the problems of algorithmic reach and distortion and the sort of perverse incentives that make the platform so profitable.
We've been talking a lot about Facebook, but obviously the story of Donald Trump and Twitter has been pretty big in the last few days as well. And Gian, I know that you've been looking at this for Wired magazine. I mean, what do you make of this quite extraordinary almost war on Twitter that Donald Trump seems to have launched?
It is interesting, right? Because when one talks of Section 230 of the Communication Decency Act, which is essentially the specific rule that Donald Trump is threatening to remove from federal law in order to threaten Twitter. This section is famous for being essentially the pillar on which the modern internet has been built. Because what it does, it establishes that internet platforms, even if it doesn't use the term platforms, are not liable for third-party content hosted on the platforms. And the interesting thing is that what actually the Section 230 does is not really giving these platforms simply the capability of hosting third-party content without being legally liable. What it did really was more giving them the freedom and the liberty to moderate the content. Because before the law was passed in 1996, every internet website could just let anybody publish anything without taking any moderation and not being liable just by appealing to the First Amendment, to free speech. The problem started when some platforms started to moderate and remove some content. And at that point, they were considered publishers and they were blamed for the illegal content on the platform, because by moderating, in a way, they had acted as publishers. So what this law did was allowing platforms to moderate. So what Trump is essentially trying to do here is trying to buffalo social media platforms, social networks, into not moderating enough, which is essentially the opposite direction a lot of the political debate has been going for the past 4 years, right? Even just the Democratic Party in the US, they want Twitter or Facebook to moderate more, to take more proactive action against certain kind of content. But now there is this sort of formidable tweeting politician, which is Trump himself, obviously, pulling in the other direction. He wants to convince platforms to moderate less. I don't know whether, though, this will be effective, because if you read the executive order with which Trump essentially started his war on Twitter, it's not clear that his plans to review or even repeal the section will ever come to pass, because the section can only be changed or repealed by Congress, and Trump is not really trying to go through Congress. It's trying to do it through a mix of reinterpretation of the law, some sort of review undertaken by state agencies. So, my interpretation of the sort of the theater going on is that it's actually theater. It's only about boosting his credentials with his base, and it's not going to have any real effect at the end of the day. But still, it is sort of iconic. It's a clear exemplification of the debate that is going on in the US and across the world about what kind of action social networks should undertake when it comes to content moderation. And it's the case that, for instance, the Democratic Party wants to repeal the section for opposite reasons. They would like Twitter to be much more, or Facebook to be much more energetic when it comes to disinformation or harmful content or hate speech. And so it's not clear where this is going to end. And it's fascinating to see the debate play out. One thing that I'm pretty intrigued about is essentially if any of these plans succeeded, so if the Section 230 were in some way changed or removed, I wonder what the approach of these platforms will be, because they could decide, I don't think they will, but they could theoretically decide to go back to the pre-1996 model, and so just essentially becoming 4chan and having just anybody publish anything without any moderation, apart from a few exceptions like federal crimes and child pornography. But apart from that, no moderation at all. Or they could go in the opposite direction, and so trying to professionalize the kind of content, so trying to minimize the kind of content that is published by normal users, and possibly trying to encourage professionals or verified content makers to publish their content. And I'm also uncertain and curious about what they could do when it comes to balancing whatever happens in the US with their global policy. Because as you know, Damian, I don't think the European market is ready for a 4chanization of every social media platform. They're not going to essentially stand for that. They're going to push back. So I wonder whether there would be like two versions of Twitter or Facebook, one for the US market post repeal of 230, and one for the European and UK market, which is much more pro-moderation. Of course, all this is essentially a pipe dream, because none of the plans of Donald Trump is going to succeed. It's not going to happen, very likely. But still, there is a battle raging around this famous section, which has been dubbed in the past the 26 words that started the modern internet, and it's a pretty neat formula to define it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, of course, we're having this debate. We're starting this debate in the UK as well, because I'm very concerned to make sure that the UK-US trade agreement doesn't include these safe harbour provisions for the big tech companies, because the trade agreement with Canada and Japan does include those provisions. I think it's important that we don't adopt Section 230 here. But I wanted to ask, as well as a journalist, and David, I'd be interested in your views on this too. There's something I think quite increasingly concerning about Donald Trump's attacks on the media, and indeed, in the wake of the reporting from Minneapolis, even a suggestion that kind of the mainstream press was a problem that needed to be worked through in order to achieve his goals of making America great again, and that the press are the enemy of the people. But this is extraordinary language from a democratic leader to be talking about the free press, the free media in his own country. I mean, as a journalist, Gian, how does that disturb you, and what are your views on that? Although I appreciate that Wired isn't typically in his line of fire when he's...
Not yet. We work on that. No, I mean, it's absolutely gutting to see some of the scenes coming out of the American cities. We've seen essentially journalists being arrested. In some cases, journalists of color being arrested, which added another layer of discomfort to the whole thing. I don't know whether Trump wanted this. I mean, I always thought his rhetoric was simply about, again, pandering to his base. But when essentially push comes to shove, of course, this sort of language can very clearly and easily spill out of control. And I don't know whether we can actually chalk this up only to Trump, but clearly the feeling in many parts of the US is that, the journalists are there just to slander the president, and they're enemy of the will of the people, which is obviously a dangerous proposition to advance. I can't obviously say that I like that as a kind of rhetoric. I would never embrace that. I don't know whether that's something that is wider, because we've seen similar language coming out of other countries. I mean, in Italy, which is my native country, I think Matteo Salvini has been pretty similar to Trump in that kind of rhetoric, but also, I mean, Bolsonaro in Brazil. There are also, I suppose, some politicians in the UK who dabble in maybe less inflammatory, but still sort of anti-media rhetoric. So it has always been a feature, in a way, of the political discourse, but it has just spilled out of control in the past few years, partly possibly for the increase in political polarization, but partly for the whole general crisis of the so-called post-truth era, right? When the post-truth era arrived, of course, the so-called mainstream media became fair game.
Do you think? I mean, David, do you think there's something sinister here with Trump almost wanting to undermine and attack the mainstream media, whilst at the same time trying to make social media, or keep social media, as kind of open and lawless as possible, where the strong man with the big following and the big voice gets to dominate the conversation, and really exclude all others?
Yes, some have known Donald Trump to be a conspiracy theorist long before he was a politician. He has advanced stories based in with no evidence that are harmful ideas, whether that be advocating the disproven notion that vaccines cause autism, or most sort of his entree into the political space was the conspiracy theory that President Obama was not an American citizen and created the birtherism movement. So it is no surprise that once he assumed the mantle of power, that he continued to use disinformation as a weapon to fulfill his goals. And we see that whether it's his harmful suggestions of how coronavirus should be treated, to the demonization of any entity that challenges him. So, the press is, in his view, not allowed to write negative stories about him. And this is another reason why he lashed out at Twitter, because Twitter labeled one of his tweets false with regards to his accusations of voter fraud. So it is sinister to me because it is an expression of the authoritarian who seeks to assume power over truth itself, to become the man is the state and he is the truth, his own truth. So it is in the tradition of authoritarian leaders who seek to destabilize the free press to their own goals and to continue to create the condition where we don't know what is true or not. So therefore, we are just falling back on the strong man. When we see the violence perpetrated by the police against journalists on live TV, it seems to be the way that his incendiary tweets are having real world consequences, in effect, giving law enforcement permission to attack the free press as targets even. And so that is truly horrifying to see that we have gotten to this place in the US. And it is my hope that we can recover from this situation and restore not only the protections that are necessary, but get back to a place where we are not being led by a conspiracy theorist who traffics in these harmful ideas as a way of exerting power.
Well, let's hope. It doesn't seem like too much to ask from a democratically elected leader. But
Right.
Charles Creel, you're been once again keeping your eye on the sinister world of social media. What's caught your attention in the last few days?
Thanks, Damian. I have been keeping my eye on social media, and a couple of stories going around about coronavirus have really caught my attention right now. First, our constant disseminator of disinformation and the self-declared liar and chaos agent Andy Wigmore has tweeted an article recently saying, quote, researchers uncover more evidence that smokers may be protected from the deadly coronavirus. The tweet points to an article in the Daily Mail, and they wrote up a UCL literature review where they aggregated results from 28 different studies looking into smoking and coronavirus. And the claim they make is that only 5% of COVID-19 patients are active smokers. Now, this has led some people to conclude that smokers are somehow protected from COVID. And there are a number of theories claiming why. One says that nicotine reduces ACE2 receptors, which are proteins in the body the virus binds to in order to infect cells. Another is that exposure to cigarette smoke and its chemicals reduces the body's immune system over time, so it then doesn't react as aggressively to COVID when the system becomes infected. But there are a lot of caveats around this, and they're really worth considering. First, some of the studies quoted in the Daily Mail article are preprint, and we've discussed this before. It means they haven't been scrutinized, they haven't been peer-reviewed, and this is a vital step in the validation process. Also, half of infected and hospitalized smokers die. And that makes the numbers a lot less rosy. That's compared to 1/3 of the rest of infected and hospitalized patients. And finally, it's also worth noting that according to the NHS, as of 2018, only 14% of Brits are smokers. So there is room for statistical error in the interpretation of these figures. The other story that I've seen going around, there are a few. About a rumor rising on Twitter and other platforms that the UK Department of Health is behind a network of Twitter accounts posing as NHS staff. And one story is in the BBC. And according to the BBC, the claims began on Twitter and quickly moved to Facebook. They attempted to examine the Twitter fake accounts, but they found that almost all had been deleted. So they ended up looking at just one account that they could find, which was labeled NHS Susan. They claim BBC says she claimed to be a junior doctor, and there were immediately red flags. Her bio, the BBC says her bio, saying she was transitioning in 2020 and fighting COVID on behalf of all LGBTQ and non-binary people, and was deaf, was a red flag. That's their claim. But then the story just stops there. There's no more information about why, in fact, this is a fake account, or why the Department of Health is not behind a network of fake Twitter accounts. And it's become a lesson to me in how to further spread disinformation without effectively debunking that disinformation. The Guardian's done a much better job with the story. According to them, the accusations were first made by John O'Connell, a writer for the website Far Right Watch. He claimed to have identified 128 fake NHS Twitter accounts, and he said the network of accounts were being coordinated to promote the concept of herd immunity and boost the government's messaging, and goes on to speak about the government's motivations in perhaps suppressing his information that he's found. Needless to say, Twitter says they have no evidence of the claim. The Department of Health deny the allegations.
Yeah, it's an interesting story, that one. I do wonder whether there'll be some other twists and turns in that tale as well. And linking back to what we talked about earlier in the podcast, I also noticed, as you mentioned, Andy Wigmore, that I think he tweeted this week, I don't know what the motivation was entirely, saying that the UK would come under the Section 230 provision. So he's obviously decided that they're going to be campaigning for that. Make of that what you will.
That's quite a prediction into the future, but who knows?
Yeah, and I mean, just before we close, I've been quite interested in looking at some of the reports from America, looking at the extent to which disinformation networks are being used to foment tensions in communities in America. I mean, have you seen any evidence of that? Is that something you've been concerned about?
I have been really concerned about it, and I'm seeing little bits of evidence here and there. First of all, there was a story this week about police arresting somebody who was heavily armed, who claimed to be part of an organization online, and then looking further into this organization, it turns out they're a far-right organization that is predicting a coming civil war in the United States. Now, somebody who's out on the edge, who believes there's a coming civil war in the United States and is preparing for that, even from the far right, is one thing. But when they have a boot filled with assault rifles, it becomes another thing entirely. So that story is out there. There's another big story hanging around out there, and I saw this about Providence in Rhode Island and the riots that happened there last night, U.S. time. After there were peaceful protests, the disinformation or possible misinformation or possible information, because it's hard to find confirmation of any of this, is that there were around 350 people waiting on the edge of town, that the police were aware of them, and then they all moved in and began burning the shopping mall and businesses and so on. So there are stories circulating about agents provocateurs. And it will be interesting to see how this plays itself out.
Absolutely. And I think we all hope that things come to a peaceful resolution sometime very soon.
Indeed, I do hope that.
I think that probably brings us to the end of our time. David, thank you so much for joining us all the way from. Where are you? Are you in up in New York State somewhere?
Yes, I am in upstate New York. I fled the city with my family before the lockdown because I saw the writing on the wall. And since everything is closed in New York and the kids are being homeschooled, it made more sense to be here. So I am thankful that I am in a peaceful place. And I am, my neighborhood of Brooklyn has been terrorized for the past week. And so it's been heartbreaking to see it from afar.
When do you think you'll go back to the city?
Well, if schools open, that would be the primary reason for us to return. But unfortunately, I'm not optimistic that schools will reopen in the fall.
And what about for you, for your teacher? Are you able to continue your teaching remotely?
Yeah, my university has not yet made its call as to whether classes will continue to be online in the fall. But assuming there is no public school and my classes are online, there's not yet a compelling reason to return.
It's and Gian, thank you as well for joining us from Wired. Again, plenty for you to be thinking and writing about as well at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, in fact, I was listening to what Charles was saying. I was just investigating this apparent coordinated campaign about a blackout in DC 2 days ago. There was a sort of strange coordination of messages going around on Twitter about DC being hit by a blackout, and also an internet blackout, in order to sort of round up and kill all the protesters. Obviously, that was not true, but Twitter is now investigating this particular campaign, #DC blackout, and that's one of the things that I'm really looking at right now, and seems to be a pretty massive story, actually. So I will likely send you some links about where this goes.
Yeah, absolutely. We'd be interested in finding more about that. But thank you all very much for joining us on the podcast today. It's been a great discussion, lots of really interesting topics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Thank you.
You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, featuring David Carroll, Gian Volpicelli, and Charles Creel. It was produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you until next time.